Hey everyone, sorry for the lack of videos recently. I was busy over the weekend. I will try to increase the frequency of videos for the coming week. Anyway, this weekend I was very busy over at the UK Games Expo. It is here every year in the British Isles that we get the largest Netrunner tournament in the country. This year it's only a regionals, not a nationals, even though it attracted more than 120 people. And I was very happy to say that my Spiky Palana deck, along with my Wizard, Dumble Fox, made it to the top 8 cut. Woohoo! Go Team YouTube! Yep, I'm pretty pleased with the result. Was hoping to get top 4 for the Palana ID, plastic ID, that would be totally deserving, since I was one of the few Palanas in the top cut, but, well, anyway. Um, some lies there. This isn't actually my deck. This deck was actually first conceived by my great sparring buddy, James, also known as First Duty. The guy that is so good at co-op deck building. He made a co-op deck revolving around government takeover 2 years ago and basically demolished store championships with it. This year he came out with Spiky Palana, a Palana deck that is semi-glacier but also packs a critical mass of net damage to really trip up the opponent. And honestly, this deck is one of the best decks you can ever get in the current meta game that is both decently competitive and fun to play. Trust me, I've had a lot of epic games with this, and my buddy James can confirm that. So if you're looking to do well at a Netrunner tournament, but don't wish to bring one of those NPE decks or unfun horizontal asset spam decks, this is the deck for you. Sleeve it up, try it for yourself. Don't question the card choices, we refined it quite a lot. Just try it for yourself and watch it unfold into massive epicness. So in this video, I'm going to give you a walkthrough of some of the key cards in the deck and how the entire deck functions. Because I haven't been actually posting any videos about it because I wanted to keep it under wraps until the regionals was over. Now that it is, let's get on to the deck. There are 3 components of the deck that make it absurdly strong. They are strong because there exist very few counters in the current runner card pool, and also because it is very easy to put the runner at a very big disadvantage. If they even become a bit careless, make a tiny little mistake against these cards, you can easily wreck their entire game. In a long drawn tournament like this regionals, 120 players, 7 Swiss rounds, top 8 cut, I managed to capitalize on a lot of opponents' mistakes. Ultimately, this deck did not drop a single game except to Alex White, reigning national champion 2015 of UK. What can I do? Anyway, let's get on to the cards themselves. First is net damage. As I said, this deck packs a critical mass of net damage, and I'm not going to list them all here. There are shocks, there are fetal AIs, there's a bunch of net damage eyes, but the main star is still the core set net damage ambush, the snare. Snare is so good. Snare is still the best. Snare deals 3 net damage. No other ambush or ice deals that much net damage without some sort of serious drawback. Psychic Fields and Komainu have the potential to deal more, but they will never flatline a runner by themselves. And Shinobi does more, but it's so conditional because of the trace and the huge rest cost. Discounting all those, Snare is still your best shot, because it's the only one that deals 3 net damage, consistently fires, and, for added bonus, lands the tag, which is super relevant against all the resource-based decks right now. And there are just not a lot of counters in the card pool for net damage. Sure, a bunch of Shaper cards, but Shaper is not in fashion right now, and more importantly, these cards are so underpowered that no one ever puts them in the deck. I mean, net damage isn't really in the meta right now. I know I say that IG is a popular card, IG is a popular archetype, and net shield might be good for it, but that's about it. Almost no one runs any net damage protection. I've Worse is your next best, but this deck doesn't really care about I've Worse. Sure, it triggers, but you're still taking more and more grindy net damage that slows your tempo down, and this is what this deck excels at, grinding the opponent. Following that, we move on to the dangerous duo, the Nisei couples. Nisei is so strong. With the introduction of Caprice Nisei, finally Jinteki actually has a way of scoring 7 general points. This is a tried and tested combo, and it's still really good. We still play it, 3 copies of each, no questions asked. There is still no counter to their effect. There is no runner card that prevents a run from ending, and this is why they're still so strong. Sure, each of these cards have their respective counters, hard counters in fact, Pollock for Caprice and Turntable for the Agenda. However, if you think about it, that is why you have two card combo, because even without one of them, the others still can protect your scoring server. If they're playing turntable, you still have Caprice to protect your scoring remote, and vice versa if they run Pollock. And most importantly, most decks don't run both of these in conjunction, so you will almost always be able to score agendas one way or another. The icing on the cake is introducing a third card that beefs up this already powerful two-card combo, the Marcus Betty. Marcus Betty is impervious to both turntable and Pollock, and is far more versatile than both the Niseis. In fact, this is one of the linchpins of this deck, and this is why what I think separates this deck from a lot of others. Marcus Betty is a very skill testing card. Placing it on the right server under the correct ice and firing the correct subroutine at the correct time. This is a lot of skill that is required. And this is why I didn't make it any further than the top 8, because I misplayed quite a bit with this card. Marcus Betty is so strong. It can fire so many different subroutines to disrupt the runner, and it takes care of a lot of powerful runner strategies that are otherwise very hard to counter. The ability to trash programs means that you can take care of powerful combos like Parasite Data Sucker, like Faust, and especially trashing sentry breakers and then forcing the runner to run into your trash program sentry. That is a killer combo that completely undoes the runner's board state. I've completely smashed a lot of criminals this way before, especially with the new Ice Cobra. Cobra cannot be clicked through unlike Ichi, so if they run out of sentry breakers, they are taking a lot of trash programs and net damage as icing on the cake. There was one game against a criminal. They ran into Marcus Betty Cobra. I used Marcus Betty to trash their mongoose without any sentry breakers. They were forced to eat the subroutines, trash one program, trash his corroder, and the net damage snipe his second corroder from his hand. With his sentry breaker and two fractors lost, he had to concede. It's so strong. And failing all of that, you still have the trusty, reliable end the run. A one-time disposable use of Caprice Nisei or Nisei Mark II. Simply trigger an end the run, and this is very powerful because unlike Caprice Nisei, it can trigger on paid abilities, which means that you can counter one of the most dominant strategies right now, which is Cutlery. You can force the run to end during a Cutlery run, and you save your ice. Everyone, Marcus Betty is pretty good. If you haven't realized that by now, you should. We now move on over to the deck list itself, where I explain the rest of the cards in detail, and this is where you can start copying the deck for yourself. Now, the cards that I mentioned, the key cards I mentioned earlier are all 3-offs, no questions asked. Nisei Mark II, Snare, Caprice, Betty, all standard 3-offs. Let's start with the agendas. Global Foot Initiative instead of Future Perfect is one of the last few changes I made to this deck, and I think James and I agree that it was a very good swap. This deck is kind of weak to Shapers, and they do tend to pack Film Critic. The fact that they can win on 3 agenda steals of 9 is kind of a big deal. Changing that to 4 out of 9 makes this deck a lot more defensive. It feels good to know that when you're trying to score that final agenda for the win, they have to find 2 more agendas of R&D to have any shot against you. So the Global Foods give you a lot more security at the expense of not being able to break R&D lock. Slightly worse against decks that have the ability to access a lot of cards because the Future Perfects cannot defend themselves, but generally I like the change to Global Food. I mean, again, in a deck where lots of cards have no counters to them on the runner side, this is one of them. Runners have no counter to the agenda text box of Global Food Initiative. It's always worth 2 points to the runner. So this is what makes it very good. Fetal AIs, don't underestimate this agenda. This agenda is nuts. I have completely lost count of the number of times my opponents have accessed this agenda without being able to pay the 2 credits. And a lot of times they just take 2 net damage, can't do anything about it. And a lot of times as well, Fetal into Snare, insta kill, especially against Faust decks. Fetal AI is phenomenal, and it's not an agenda that like NAPD you just leave in your deck and hope that they run into it. You can actually score this, and it creates a very interesting mind game. Do you run my remote? If you do, you better make sure you have 2 cards and 2 credits to steal this agenda. Otherwise, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Sure, it's never palatable to spend 5 advancements on 2 agenda points, but it's something you can do and something the opponent has to respect. This is something you can definitely leverage on if you can read your opponent very well. We play 3 copies of it, no less, to place the threat on the runner. to achieve that critical mass of net damage available. And in a meta game where R&D deep digs are very powerful between medium R&D interfaces and now turning wheel, having a lot of net damage really makes the runner consider twice before running, which means that your agendas just stay safer in general. Fetal AI also gives you an out against runners who run out of deck cards. If they go down to less than 3 or even 2 hit points, suddenly your fetal AIs are free to score. As long as they don't have film critic, you can actually score fetal AIs naked and they can't do anything about it, because if they try to steal it, they flatline. Philotic Entanglement. This was a card that was in James's original deck. I questioned it heavily. I changed it to Corporate Sales Team, but I realized that with Philotic in your deck, you can do so much more. The net damage isn't always the most relevant, but it is something. It's still something. It's something that can snipe that Levy or that same old thing from their hand and completely make them lose the game. Most importantly, it is never advanceable. So leaving it in the remote is something you can do. Scoring it when they least expect it is something you can do. Most runners expect that to score agendas, a Palana deck or a Jinteki deck has to advance their agendas. But with that one Philotic Insight, they can't be sure anymore. They have to keep checking a remote, and that is where you can bait them into more mistakes, like running to snares instead. Speaking of snare, Shock is another card, ambush in the deck. This seems like a very weak card, and it is. One net damage is not the most impactful, and most runners don't need to run archives. This is not IG. However, it is a good counter against a lot of Anarch decks nowadays which want to access archives. Dumble Fox need their data sucker counters. Where do they go for it? Archives. Net damage for you. Noise, you're milling my cards. Where do you go to fetch them? Archives. More net damage for you. Shock is amazing in those situations. And even against all other runners, the ability to inflict net damage passively without spending credits is so huge. This is why Fetal AI and Shock are so good. Because if you're poor, as this deck, you can't fire snares. But the runner still has to respect the possibility of hitting Shocks and Fetal AIs. Moving on, Caprice, Marcus Betty, yep, self-explanatory. Chrysium Grid. This was also one of the later changes. I realized that this deck was pretty weak without Chrysium Grid. It kind of dies to Siphon Spam and most importantly, Blackmail Apocalypse. That is a thing Valencia can do when they ignore your eyes. Betty is turned off. If you can't raise your eyes, Betty does nothing. So you need a counter for that, and we have Chrysium Grid. One copy is enough because you can recur it with Crick, which is an ice we have 3 of, and we'll talk more about it later. But Chrysium Grid didn't really do much in the entire day at the regionals. However, I can see it doing big work against Siphon decks and Valencia decks, both of which I did not encounter. If you don't expect Siphon Spam or Blackmails, you can swap the Chrysium Grid and the wraparound for a second Eli. Eli is just a really good piece of ice, but I wouldn't. It really is really good. The ability to just shut off Siphons completely, maybe shut off indexings against Shaper. Chrysium is still a really good card, synergizes with Crick. Why not play it? I mean, there are more and more runner side strategies nowadays that completely ignore ice, and ice is kind of a big part of this deck, so I would prefer to have my Chrysium Grid. Operations, standard 9 econ operations for Jinteki. All you need is 9 because your ID gives you a lot of money. Now that you have a lot of money with Palana foods, you can actually reliably trigger snares most of the time. This is a big problem that Jinteki used to have. Snare is a powerful card, but you never seem to have the money to trigger it. Now you can. Still, this deck does find itself short of money a lot of the time, especially if Employee Strike is played against you. I like to include one more money card in this deck, but its deck space is very tight. So let's move on to the ice. Another big consideration for the ice selection is that almost all of the ice, you notice, is 3 costs or less. This is why we can get away with so few money cards. And speaking of which, the money cards are all operations and ID based, so Wizard does nothing against it. Wizard is one of the strongest decks in the meta, and I'm very happy to make this choice. Back to the ice. Yes, 3 costs or less. Everything is 3 costs or less. Look at this. Look at the ice. Blue color. There, whole bunch of 1, 2, 3. Very few above. And those that are above are really impactful. Let's talk about these first. At 4 cost, we have the what is our 4 cost ice? Yes, Cobra. I explained it in the Marcus Betty section. This is so good with Marcus Betty. Just watch out for the Insta Parasite with Clone Chip. 5 cost section, we have Tollbooth. Tollbooth is phenomenal, still one of the best pieces of ice in the game, well worth the deck slot. You do need a high strength and the run code gate, and Tollbooth with the encounter ability is icing on the cake. Wait, that's not 5 cost, that's 8 cost. That is the most expensive ice in the deck. But placing this ice is very key. You usually want it on your weaker server, which is HQ against criminals, R&D against shapers, and maybe against Anox you would like it on the remote, because Anox generally don't make enough money to break Tollbooth. At 7 cost we have Assassins, still a very solid piece of ice. Don't want to include too many because this deck really needs the money to trigger snares, but the Surprise Assassin can be really fatal, and hey, it triggers off Betty as well. You can easily flatline someone on the net damage trace, which is really funny. Moving on, 5 costs we have Komainu. Komainu, very reliable. Runners have to respect it early on. They can't run because they know you might run Komainu. They don't want to drop their entire hand because they then have to jack out, otherwise they'll hit a shock. It's always a shock. At 5 costs we also have Ichis. You do not want to run any less than 2 Ichis because Ichis are your out against Shaper. Shapers can easily break the 5 strength ice with David, 3 strength and lower ice with their standard breaker suite. So you need the strength 4 sentry in Ichi to really punish Shapers, because otherwise your deck just kind of falls to Shapers. Sure, they do have Artman 4, but this is where Marcus Betty comes in again. Marcus Betty triggers off Ichi, kills the Artman 4, they're out of options. So Ichi is really good, you want 2 copies of it, and it still does great work against all the other runners as well. Because everyone's running Mimic, so Ichi becomes very good. So now let's look at the smaller ice. Jinteki has a lot of small ice, and it is a waste not to take advantage of that. We start with Eli, which is completely not a Jinteki ice, but it's still really good. It's still, even at 2 influence, Eli is still a must-have. One of the few enderruns in the deck. Jinteki doesn't have a lot of enderruns, so you really want to spend as much influence as possible on those enderruns. Same with Wraparound. And this one actually taxes Faust a lot, so much that they have to get their David out. A pretty solid include against all the Anarchs. Wall of Static, amazing because it's exactly at 3 strength. That is where you want to be. Against Faust, they need to actually pump their Faust up. This is why I picked Wall of Static over the Himitsu Bako, which is 1 fewer to res, but it's so easy to break with Faust. Moving on, we have Crick. Crick is amazing, again for the strength 3, it being strength 3. Not many people run York, so Crick is amazing. And by the way, Crick actually goes on Centrals way more often than going on Archives. A lot of decks don't really care about running Archives, and those that do have David to break Archives Crick. So Crick is actually mostly used on Centrals, and it punishes a lot of the current code gate breakers. Think about it. Faust requires 2 cards. Passport requires 3 credits, which is pretty insane. Zuki Master, 3 credits. Really only Cyber Cypher and York do very well against it. York doesn't see a lot of play, and Cyber Cypher is in Shaper. They still need to direct it at the correct server, which means you can spread your cricks around your centrals, making it very hard for their lives. Same thing with Yagura. It's a one-off because it really only is that somewhat effective on R&D, but it really punishes anyone who thinks they can run with simply a Mimic out. That 1 net damage adds up to a lot. They can't ignore the 1 net damage given how spiky the rest of the deck is, and the top card of R&D effect is gravy icing on the cake. It protects your R&D that much more. Let's move on to Swordsman. Meta call against all the Fausts that is running around. Pretty simple, straightforward. Works with Marcus Petty. Didn't use it too much on the day, but again, they have to respect the 1 net damage. Even if they are not AI decks, they still have to break this subroutine. Finally, Rainbow. Rainbow was a substitute. As I said earlier, I wanted the second Eli, but now with Crimson Grid, I need to swap the Enderrun for another Enderrun. There are lots of options available. Lotus Field is there, but it goes against my philosophy of having cheap ice. 5 to res for 4 strength is really not all that good, especially given that it can be spoon and that Cyber Cypher breaks it for 1 credit, not palatable at all. So I go for Rainbow instead. Same strength, 2 less to res, that is such a huge change. Since so many people are running AI breakers, the multi subtype nature doesn't really matter. And most importantly, it is actually a benefit against all the cutlery. It protects your key eyes from being destroyed by fork, knives, and spoons. Think of your big eyes, your assassins, your Tollbooths. Placing a rainbow above them kind of stops that. And that's another beautiful thing you can do with Crick as well. Crick on Tollbooth is one of the best servers you can ever make. It is impervious to being spoon. Your Crick just takes the spoon. Big deal. It was only 1 to res. And they cannot let Crick fire, because if Crick fires, you get a Betty out, and you can play the Betty side game on Toe Wolf to end the spoon run. So Crick is an amazing piece of ice because it is so annoying for such a low res cost. And this is what makes the deck sing. It can operate on very few credits, and it generates a lot of money. It has 6 end runs, so when you are actually playing this deck, which is kind of more important, piloting this deck is not very easy. You only have 6 end runs: the Toe Booth, the 4 barriers, and Rainbow. So that is 6 end run ice in the deck. You need 1 end run at the base of your remote to begin scoring agendas. That is actually quite tricky, because if you open with end run ice in your hand, you don't want to step it on your remote. You want to protect your centrals. But if you do, it might be a long time before you see an end run on the remote, and that is one of the ways you can lose easily, by not finding your end run. Another big issue with the deck is that there are only 3 Niseis and no fast tracks. So there are a lot of times where you don't want to score agendas because all the agendas you have are fetals and global foods that you don't really want to score. That happens as well. And finally, if you don't see your upgrades, you're kind of in trouble. So you do still need to protect R&D, even though it protects itself. But overall, just practice with it. It is a really, really fun deck. It has the potential to grind runners out down to their last card and just flatline them at the end because they've run out of cards to run. It is also capable of rushing out if you get a very good start, enough money, and the correct upgrade, correct ice, and the agenda. And most of all, you don't get tired of playing with it, because even if you play against your same opponent 5 different times, you can play it 5 different ways. Is that agenda a Nisei or a fetal? Is that asset, naked asset, is it a Jackson or is it a snare? Is that upgrade in the scoring remote a Caprice or a Christian Bluff? There are so many mind games you can play with this deck. And this is the spirit of Netrunner, isn't it? When your in-game decisions actually make a meaningful impact on how the game draws out. I'm going to showcase some of my tournament games with this deck over the course of the week, and please do tune into them. I'll have James by my side to commentate as well, since he's very familiar with the deck, and we'll have a very good time. I hope you have as much of a fun time as me playing this deck, because even though it hasn't won any tournaments, I can vouch for a ball of a time when you play with it. It really is a very fun deck to play, both for your opponent and for yourself. And that is the spirit of Netrunner. Thanks for watching, happy netrunning, goodbye.